The alarm clock hadn't worked in 3 years, but Frank Donovan woke at 5:30 anyway, same as he had since boot camp in 1970. The cabin held onto the cold from last night's floorboards, groaning under his weight as he shuffled toward the kitchen in wool socks and yesterday's flannel. No point changing when you lived alone, no one to smell you, no one to judge the coffee stains down the front or the way his beard had gone from salt and pepper to mostly salt over the winter. He filled the kettle with water that tasted like rust and iron, set it on the stove that Mary had picked out at a yard sale in 1980. The enamel had chipped away on one side, exposing blackened metal underneath. Everything in this place was falling apart slow enough that you didn't notice until you really looked. The refrigerator hummed louder than it used to. The bathroom faucet dripped all night no matter how tight you cranked it. The porch steps sagged in the middle from 40 years of boots coming and going. Mostly going now. The coffee came out black and bitter the way he'd learned to drink it in Da Nang. He carried the chipped mug to the kitchen table and sat in the chair that faced the window, looking out at pine trees and morning mist that clung to the ground like it had nowhere else to be. Through the fog, he could just make out the outline of his Chevy C10 navy blue paint faded to something closer to gray. The truck was older than most marriages these days. Bought it in 1985, same year as the stove, back when David was still in elementary school, and Mary would pack sandwiches for the three of them to eat while Frank taught the boy how to change oil. David would be 42 now. Frank did the math every morning, couldn't help it. 42 years old with a family of his own somewhere in Saddle, living a life that didn't include phone calls to Oak Ridge, Oregon. The wedding photo on the wall showed a different version of Frank and Mary, both of them young and stupid with hope. She wore a simple white dress, nothing fancy because they couldn't afford fancy in 1982. He wore his dress blues because the recruiter had told him it would make a hell of an impression, and it had. Mary's father shook his hand so hard Frank thought his arm might come off. A Marine, a man with discipline, with honor, with a future. Turned out the future was sitting alone in a cold kitchen, drinking bad coffee and staring at ghosts. Frank stood and walked to the propane heater in the corner, turned the knob until blue flame licked up behind the grate. The heat would take 20 minutes to reach the far walls. By then he'd be dressed and ready to drive into town. Same routine he'd followed every Friday for the past 3 years, ever since retirement had stripped away the reason to get up in the morning. 40 years he'd worked as a carpenter, building houses and cabinets and furniture for people who paid on time and people who didn't. His hands told the story better than words. Knuckles swollen with arthritis, scars across 3 fingers from a table saw accident in '91. Calluses so thick he couldn't feel paper anymore when he touched it. These hands had built the crib David slept in as a baby, built the dining room table where they'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner for 20 years, built the coffin Mary was buried in because Frank couldn't stand the thought of some factory-made box holding her. He dressed in clean jeans and a red flannel that Mary had given him for Christmas 2018, the last Christmas before the cancer took her voice, then her strength, then everything else. The shirt still smelled like the cedar chest where he kept it between wearings. He pulled on work boots that didn't have any work to go to, tied them out of habit, and grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. The Chevy coughed twice before the engine caught, exhaust puffing white in the December air. Frank let it warm up while he scraped frost from the windshield. Each stroke of the scraper revealing more of the road ahead, the long gravel driveway that connected his cabin to County Road 47, which connected to Highway 22, which connected to Oak Ridge, proper population 3,200, and dropping every year as the young folks moved to Eugene or Portland or anywhere that promised something more than logging trucks and meth labs. He drove slow partially because the transmission slipped if you pushed it too hard, partially because there was no reason to hurry. The radio played country music older than most of the cars on the road. George Strait singing about the Amarillo sky. Merle Haggard asking if we'd ever see the end of the line. Frank kept the volume low background noise to fill the cab so he wouldn't have to listen to his own breathing. Oak Ridge appeared through the trees like it always did, a collection of buildings that time forgot. The gas station with analog pumps. The hardware store with boards in the window advertising sales from 2003. The post office that opened 3 days a week if you were lucky. And at the end of Main Street, squatting between an antique shop and a boarded-up laundromat, the Oak Ridge Family Diner, with its neon sign that only lit up the first 4 letters, OAKR. Frank parked in the gravel lot, same spot he always took far enough from the door that he had to walk. His knees complained about the cold, both of them, a matching set of artillery that fired with every step. The VA kept sending him letters about knee replacement surgery, but what was the point? Get new knees so you could walk around an empty cabin more efficiently. The diner smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee, the kind of smell that soaked into your clothes and stayed there all day. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, most of them empty this early. A handful of loggers sat at the counter, bent over plates of eggs and hash browns. Not talking because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't been said 1,000 times already. Frank took booth 7 in the back corner, the one that faced the kitchen, and gave him a clearer view of the front door. Old habits from Vietnam: never sit with your back exposed, always know your exits. 44 years since he'd come home, and he still couldn't shake the training still scanned rooms for threats that hadn't existed since 1972. The waitress who usually worked Fridays had quit last month, moved to Bend with her boyfriend. This new one was younger, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that looked like they'd been tired for a long time. Her name tag read Claire in faded black marker. She approached the table with a coffee pot in one hand and a laminated menu in the other, but Frank waved off the menu. Coffee, black, eggs over easy, wheat toast. Same order every Friday for 3 years. She nodded, wrote nothing down, and turned back toward the kitchen. That's when Frank noticed the way she held her left arm slightly curved inward, like she was protecting something. And when the sleeve of her uniform rode up as she reached for a coffee mug, he saw it purple and yellow bruises in the distinct shape of fingers wrapped around her wrist like a bracelet of violence. His chest tightened. The coffee tasted suddenly metallic in his mouth. Frank had seen bruises like that before, back when he was 12 years old, and his mother wore long sleeves even in summer. His father had worked at the sawmill, came home every night smelling like bourbon and rage. Frank learned to recognize the signs: the way his mother flinched when doors slammed, the way she apologized for things that weren't her fault, the careful choreography of a woman trying to make herself smaller, quieter, less likely to provoke the next outburst. The sound of the kitchen door swinging open snapped him back to the present. A thick-set man emerged, maybe late 40s, with a round face and small eyes that darted around the diner like he was counting every customer, calculating every dollar. He wore a grease-stained apron and the kind of expression that suggested he enjoyed being the boss a little too much. Wade Carson. Frank had heard the name around town. Inherited the diner from his father, ran it the same way his father had: cheap food, cheaper wages, and no patience for anyone who questioned his methods. Wade's voice carried across the diner, sharp and loud. Claire, table 4 needs refills. Claire, where's the order for booth 2? Claire, stop standing around and move. Each command made her shoulders tighten, made her move faster, made her smaller. Frank watched her pour coffee for table 4 with hands that trembled just enough to make the liquid slosh in the pot. He watched Wade follow her with his eyes tracking her movements like a predator watching prey. When Claire brought Frank his breakfast, she set the plate down carefully, precisely, as if any mistake might have consequences. Her gaze stayed fixed on the table. Looks good. Thank you. She glanced up for half a second, surprised by simple politeness, then disappeared back into the rhythm of work that looked more like survival. Frank ate slowly, chewing eggs that had gone cold, watching the dynamics play out in front of him. Wade called Claire into the kitchen. Through the order window, Frank saw him lean in close, saw Claire's body language, shoulders hunched, head down, that universal posture of someone being berated for crimes both real and imagined. When she came back out, her eyes were red. The loggers at the counter paid their checks and left their absence, making the diner feel even emptier. Frank sat in booth 7 with half a piece of toast left and no appetite to finish it. He left a $20 bill under his coffee cup, more than twice what breakfast cost, and walked out into the morning that had warmed just enough to melt the frost. He drove to the hardware store because driving home felt too much like surrender. The aisles smelled like sawdust and WD-40 familiar and comforting. He wandered past bins of screws and nails, past power tools he didn't need, past lumber stacked in the back. His hands itched to build something, anything, but what was the point? You built things for people, for family, for a reason. The cashier was a kid, maybe 19, with a name tag that said Trevor and a face that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Frank bought a box of wood screws he didn't need and drove back to the cabin, where he spent the afternoon in the garage workshop, that had once been his sanctuary. The smell of sawdust still clung to everything: the workbench, the walls, the rafters overhead. Tools hung on pegboard, each one in its assigned place, each one unused for months. Frank picked up a hammer, felt its weight, remembered the satisfaction of driving nails into studs, of seeing a house take shape from nothing but plans and lumber and sweat. Now the hammer felt too heavy. His shoulder ached just from lifting it. He set it back on the pegboard and stared at the half-finished birdhouse on the workbench. He'd started it 3 weeks ago, got as far as cutting the pieces and drilling the entrance hole before asking himself the question that killed the project. Who was it for? Who would see it? Who would care? The afternoon faded into evening, the winter sun dropping behind the mountains by 4 o'clock. Frank made a sandwich for dinner, ham and cheese on bread that was 1 day past fresh, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table alone felt too ceremonial, too much like admitting defeat. The television played the news. War in Ukraine. Stock market down. Weather turning colder. Frank watched without seeing background noise to fill the house with something other than his own heartbeat. When the news ended, he turned it off and sat in the recliner that still had the indentation from Mary's body pressed into the cushions. She'd sit there every evening, knitting or reading or just existing in the same space as him, and that had been enough, more than enough. The silence now was different, active, aggressive. It pressed down on him like something physical, something he couldn't fight off with tools or strength or discipline. He thought about Claire at the diner, thought about those bruises, thought about the way Wade had spoken to her, the way she'd made herself smaller with each word. He thought about his mother in that house in Bend, hiding bruises under makeup and long sleeves, apologizing for being in the way, for existing too loudly, for failing to be invisible enough. Frank had been 12 when he'd finally understood what was happening. 13 when he tried to stop it, stepping between his father and mother in the kitchen, putting his child's body between the fist and the target. His father had backhanded him so hard he'd seen stars, left him bleeding on the linoleum while his mother screamed. But it had worked. The distraction, the interruption. His mother hadn't gotten hit that night. 2 weeks later, his father had a heart attack at the sawmill, dropped dead between 2 pallets of pine boards. Frank's mother cried at the funeral. Real tears. Whether from grief or relief, Frank never knew. Maybe both. Maybe something more complicated than a 13-year-old could understand. The phone on the kitchen wall hadn't rung in 3 months. Frank stared at it now, at the yellowed plastic and the curly cord that had been white once. He knew David's number by heart, could dial it in his sleep, but his hand wouldn't reach for the receiver. Too much pride, too much time, too much unsaid. Mary had begged him to call. Near the end, when the morphine barely touched the pain, she'd gripped his hand with what little strength she had left and whispered, "Promise me you'll call David. Promise me you won't die alone the way I'm dying alone." He'd promised. Lied right to her face while she was dying. Frank stood and walked to the bedroom, pulled open the bottom drawer of the dresser, where he kept things he couldn't throw away but couldn't look at either. Photos mostly. David as a baby, red-faced and screaming. David at 10 holding a fish they'd caught at Lost Lake. David at 17 wearing his graduation cap and looking like he couldn't wait to leave. Underneath the photos was the letter David had sent 8 years ago, the last communication between them. Frank unfolded it, the creases worn soft from being opened and refolded too many times. "Dad, I don't know how else to say this. I'm getting married. Sarah and I are building a life together, and I want you to be part of it. But I can't keep trying to be someone I'm not just to earn your respect. I'm not going to be a carpenter. I'm not going to work with my hands the way you think a real man should. And if you can't accept that, then maybe it's better if we don't talk for a while. I love you, but I can't keep breaking myself against your expectations. David." Frank had never responded. Pride wouldn't let him. The thought of admitting he'd been wrong, of admitting that his idea of manhood was too narrow, too rigid, it stuck in his throat like broken glass. So he'd let the silence stretch from weeks into months, into years. Let it harden into something permanent. Mary had gone to the wedding without him, came back with photos of David and Sarah, both of them glowing with the kind of happiness that made Frank's chest ache. She'd set the photos on the mantle where Frank would have to see them every day, a silent accusation. "You're losing him. You've already lost him. This is your fault." He refolded the letter, tucked it back under the photos, closed the drawer. Sleep came eventually fitful and thin, filled with dreams of rice paddies and jungle rot, and the faces of men he'd killed and men who'd tried to kill him. Friday arrived again identical to every Friday before it. Same alarm at 5:30 that didn't need to ring. Same coffee that tasted like rust. Same drive into town through morning fog that clung to everything like regret. The diner was busier this time, loggers and truckers filling most of the booths, but booth 7 stood empty like it was waiting for him, and Frank took his place, ordered the same breakfast. From Claire watched her move through the diner with that same careful efficiency. But today the bruises on her wrist had company, a fresh mark on her jawline, half hidden by makeup that didn't quite match her skin tone. Purple bleeding into yellow, bleeding into green, the kind of bruise that announced its age in color gradients. Wade emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of food, stopped at table 4 to slam plates down hard enough to make silverware jump. One of the loggers said something Frank couldn't hear. Wade's face went red, mouth opening to deliver what was clearly a well-practiced tirade, but then he seemed to remember there were witnesses. He bit back whatever he'd been about to say, turned on his heel, and stalked back to the kitchen. Claire brought Frank's coffee with hands that shook worse than last week. She set the cup down too fast, liquid sloshing over the rim onto the table. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Let me..." She grabbed napkins, started mopping up the spill with movements that bordered on frantic. Frank reached out, gently touched her wrist, the one without bruises, stopping her. "It's okay. Just coffee. No harm done." She looked at him, then really looked, and something passed between them that Frank couldn't name. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. The unspoken language of people who'd survived things they couldn't talk about. "Thank you." The words came out barely above a whisper, but they carried weight. Frank nodded, released her wrist, watched her disappear back into the choreography of survival. He stayed longer than usual, nursing his coffee until it went cold, watching Wade bark orders and Claire trying to be invisible. When Wade finally retreated to his office in the back, Frank approached the counter where Claire was wiping down the laminate surface with determined focus. "Miss, I'm sorry to bother you." She looked up, surprised, wary. In his peripheral vision, Frank saw her calculate whether this was going to be the kind of conversation that got her in trouble. "I just wanted to say, and you can tell me to mind my own business, but if you need help, there are people who can help. Good people. You don't have to..." "I'm fine." Her voice came out too quick, too sharp, the practiced response of someone who'd been asked before. "Everything's fine." Frank nodded slowly, pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote on a napkin. "Pastor Raymond Butler, Oak Ridge Baptist Church, 541-555-0147. He slid the napkin across the counter. "His friend, good man, if you ever need to talk." "Or anything else." Claire stared at the napkin like it might explode. Her hand hovered over it, not quite touching, not quite refusing. "I should get back to work." She turned away, but the napkin disappeared into her apron pocket before Wade's office door opened and the moment shattered. Frank left another 20 under his coffee cup and drove to the Oak Ridge Public Library, a squat brick building with a parking lot that hosted more birds than cars. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and the heating system that never worked right. Mrs. Dawson sat behind the circulation desk, reading, glasses perched on her nose, working through a stack of returned books with the unhurried precision of someone who had nowhere else to be. "Frank, good to see you. Your usual section." Frank nodded. The library kept a modest collection of military history and westerns in the back corner, and Frank had worked his way through most of it over the past 3 years. He wasn't here for books today, though. A small figure sat at one of the study tables, bent over a sketch pad with the intense concentration that only children could muster. The boy looked maybe 8 or 9, dark hair falling across his forehead, tongue poking out the corner of his mouth as he drew. Frank approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. The boy's drawing showed surprising skill for his age, a rough landscape with mountains and trees, and in the foreground a large figure standing protectively in front of 2 smaller ones. "That's good work." The boy jumped, pencil skittering across the page, leaving an unintended line through the sky. He looked up with wide eyes, shoulders immediately hunching defensive. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. Just you've got talent there." The boy relaxed slightly, looking down at his drawing with something like embarrassment and pride mixed together. "Thanks, it's not finished yet. What's it going to be?" "When it is finished," the boy shrugged one shoulder, lifting then dropping in that universal kid gesture that meant he didn't know how to put it into words. "Just someone keeping his family safe, like protecting them. Frank felt something twist in his chest. He pulled out the chair across from the boy. Mind if I sit? I'm Frank? The boy glanced toward Mrs. Dawson at the desk, some silent check-in that Frank recognized. Stranger danger, don't talk to people you don't know. But Mrs. Dawson gave a small nod, vouching for Frank's safety, and the boy turned back. I'm Tommy. Nice to meet you, Tommy. You come here a lot every day after school. Mom works until 6, so I do homework here. Mrs. Dawson lets me draw when I'm done. Your mom works at the diner. Claire Tommy's eyes went cautious again, that wariness returning. How'd you know I eat there sometimes? Your mom's a good waitress. Works hard. Tommy nodded but didn't elaborate. His pencil moved across the page again, adding details to the protective figure in the foreground. Broad shoulders, strong stance, face that looked determined but kind. You want to be an artist when you grow up, maybe. Or make comic books. Stories where the good guys win. Good guys don't always win, kid. Frank bit back the words before they left his mouth. What kid needed to hear that? What good did it do to tell an 8-year-old that the world was mostly bad guys winning and good guys dying in rice paddies thousands of miles from home? That's a worthy goal. World needs more stories like that. Tommy smiled, small but genuine, and for a moment Frank saw David at that age, back when his son still looked at him like he hung the moon before disappointment and distance had replaced admiration. Do you like to draw? Used to, sort of. I wanted to be an architect when I was young. Design buildings. Why didn't you? The question landed with the blunt force that only children's questions could deliver. No malice, no judgment, just pure curiosity about why someone wouldn't do what they wanted to do. War happened. Vietnam. Then life. Got a job doing carpentry. Married a good woman, had a son. Didn't have time for dreams about buildings. Do you miss it? Frank considered the question, surprised by its weight. Did he miss it? Or had he convinced himself that he'd never really wanted it in the first place? That it was just a childish fantasy he'd outgrown? Yeah, sometimes. I miss a lot of things. Tommy went back to his drawing, adding shadows under the protective figure's feet, grounding him in the landscape. Frank watched, remembering the satisfaction of creating something from nothing, of seeing an idea take shape in physical form. Your mom. She doing okay? Tommy's pencil stopped. His hand tightened around it, knuckles going white. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. She's tired a lot. And sad. She tries to hide it, but I can tell. That's hard. Being able to tell when someone's sad, but not being able to help. Tommy nodded, still not looking up from his drawing. Mr. Wade, he's Mom's boss. He's not nice to her. He yells, a lot. And sometimes I hear Mom crying on the phone when she thinks I'm asleep. Frank's jaw tightened. He'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed by a child who shouldn't have to know these things made something old and violent stir in his chest. Has your mom talked to anyone about Mr. Wade, the police, or... She says we can't, says Mr. Wade knows people, and there's other stuff. My dad, my real dad, he's not good either. Mom says if we make trouble, he might find us. The pieces assembled themselves in Frank's mind. A woman trapped between two threats, trying to protect her son, trying to survive one day at a time. And a boy who understood far too much, who drew pictures of protectors because the real world hadn't provided any. Tommy, listen to me. Your mom is doing the best she can, and you're a good kid for understanding that. But sometimes people need help, and it's not weak to accept it. It's smart. Mom says asking for help just makes things worse. Sometimes that's true, but not always. Sometimes help is the only thing that makes things better. Mrs. Dawson called from the desk, Tommy, your mom's here. Frank turned to see Claire standing in the doorway, still in her diner uniform, looking exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. When she saw Frank sitting with Tommy, her expression shifted through several emotions too fast to track surprise. Worry, something that might have been hope or might have been fear. Tommy grabbed his sketch pad and pencil, shoved them into a backpack that had seen better days. Thanks for talking to me, Mr. Frank. Anytime, Tommy. Keep drawing. You've got a gift. The boy hurried to his mother, who put a hand on his shoulder and steered him toward the door without a word to Frank. But at the threshold, she paused, turned back, and their eyes met across the space between them. In that moment, Frank saw everything she couldn't say. The fear, the desperation, the stubborn pride, that insisted she could handle it alone, and the growing realization that maybe she couldn't. Then they were gone, the door swinging shut behind them with a poof pneumatic hiss. Mrs. Dawson came around the desk, her expression troubled. That boy comes in here every day. Never makes trouble, always does his homework, stays quiet as a mouse. But I've seen the way his mother looks when she picks him up. Haunted Frank. That woman looks haunted. How long's this been going on? Year or so, best I can tell. Used to be, Claire would smile, sometimes chat a little. Now she just collects Tommy and leaves. And Wade Carson. God forgive me, but that man is poison. Has anyone reported him to whose sheriff's office? Half of them eat at the diner for free because Wade comps their meals. And Claire's got no family here, no support system. She's just trying to survive. Frank drove home through twilight that came too early, the mountains eating the sun before 5 o'clock. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tight, knuckles white against the worn plastic. The cabin waited for him, cold and empty, the propane heater struggling to warm rooms that held more ghosts than furniture. He stood in the garage workshop, staring at tools that had built homes for other people's families, wondering when his life had become this, a series of empty routines punctuated by regret. Mary's voice echoed in his memory, clear as if she were standing next to him. Use your honor to help people, Frank. That's what duty means. Not just following orders, helping people. The phone rang sudden and sharp in the silence. Frank nearly jumped, so unexpected was the sound. He hurried inside, caught it on the fourth ring. Hello. Silence on the other end. No, not quite silence, breathing. Someone was there. Hello, anyone there? A click. Dial tone. Frank stood holding the dead receiver, pulse hammering in his throat for reasons he couldn't name. Wrong number, probably. Or teenagers playing pranks. But something about it felt wrong, felt deliberate. He hung up and walked to the window, looking out at the woods that surrounded his cabin. The trees stood dark against the fading light, sentinel quiet. Nothing moved, nothing threatened. But the sense of unease lingered, that old combat instinct that said something was wrong even when you couldn't see it yet. Frank made himself a dinner he didn't eat, sat in the recliner with the TV on, but the volume muted, watching flickering images of a world that kept spinning whether he engaged with it or not. Eventually he gave up and went to bed, where sleep came thin and restless, populated by dreams that mixed Vietnam and the diner, and Tommy's drawings of protective figures who might not show up when they were needed. Saturday morning arrived, gray and cold, threatening snow that the forecast said might actually deliver this time. Frank drove to church for the first time in 6 months, pulling into the gravel lot of Oak Ridge Baptist Church just as the 10 o'clock service let out. The building was simple white clapboard with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left and had been meaning to get fixed for the past decade. People filed out the front doors, shaking hands with Pastor Raymond Butler, who stood on the steps in his black suit and clerical collar despite the cold. Ray saw Frank and his face lit up with genuine pleasure. Frank Donovan, thought maybe you'd fallen off the face of the earth. Been keeping to myself, I noticed. 6 months is keeping to yourself. 7 months is hiding. Where are we on that spectrum? Frank managed a weak smile. Closer to 7 than 6, I guess. Ray descended the steps, clasping Frank's hand in both of his. The pastor was 71 years old, same as Frank would be in 4 years, and every one of those years showed in the lines around his eyes and the white of his hair. But his grip was still firm, his gaze still sharp. Walk with me. They circled the church, following a path worn into the grass by decades of similar walks. The congregation dispersed to their cars' engines, starting tires, crunching on gravel, until only quiet remained. You look like a man carrying something heavy. Frank stopped walking, stared at the mountains that ringed the valley, took a breath that hurt going down. You remember my mother, what my father did to her? Ray's expression sobered immediately. I remember. You were just a kid, but you stood between them, took the hit meant for her. There's a woman at the diner, Claire Montgomery. She's got a boy, maybe 8 or 9, and she's got bruises that look familiar. Wade Carson. Frank nodded. Ray's jaw tightened. I've heard things. Nothing concrete enough to act on, but whispers. Wade's got a mean streak and a drinking problem, and those two things together rarely end well. She's scared, Ray. Scared to report it, scared to run, scared to do anything but keep her head down and hope she survives. And her kid Tommy, he's drawing pictures of heroes because the real world isn't providing any. So be one. The words came simple and direct. No hesitation. Frank turned to look at his friend. I'm 67 years old. I got bad knees, worse shoulders, and no authority to intervene in someone else's life. You got experience. You got morals. You got the ability to stand between someone and the thing that's hurting them. Same as you did when you were 13. Age hasn't changed what you can do, Frank. Only your willingness to do it. Frank looked away. And if I make things worse, if Wade retaliates, if her ex-husband shows up because I stirred the pot, then you deal with those consequences when they come. But right now, today, there's a woman and a boy who need help, and you're the only one who's noticed. You really want to look back 5 years from now and wonder if you could have saved them. The question hung in the cold air between them. Frank had spent 8 years looking back, wondering if he could have saved his marriage to Mary, could have saved his relationship with David. Adding Claire and Tommy to that list felt like more weight than he could carry. But Mary's voice whispered in his memory, use your honor to help people. I don't know what to do, Ray. Start by showing up. Be present. Let her know she's not alone. Sometimes that's enough to give someone the courage to save themselves. And if it's not enough, then we figure out next steps together. Church has resources, shelter space, legal aid counseling. We can help Frank. But first she needs to know help exists. They stood in silence while clouds moved overhead, heavy with snow that hadn't fallen yet. Frank thought about Tommy's drawings about Claire's bruises, about the way she looked at him in the library, that moment of connection, of unspoken understanding. Okay. Ray squeezed his shoulder. Good man. Come by the church office Monday morning. We'll put together a plan. Frank drove home through the first snowflakes of winter, watching them melt on the windshield before the wipers swept them away. The cabin felt less empty somehow, or maybe he just felt less empty in it. Purpose, even tentative, uncertain purpose, had a way of filling space that loneliness left behind. He spent the afternoon in the workshop, and this time when he picked up tools, they didn't feel too heavy. He worked on the birdhouse that had sat unfinished for weeks, cutting and sanding and fitting pieces together with the muscle memory of 40 years of carpentry. The entrance hole needed to be 1¼ inches for chickadees. The roof needed to slope for water runoff. The mounting hole needed to be centered for stability. Details mattered. Precision mattered. Getting it right mattered because someone, maybe Tommy, maybe Tommy's mother, maybe just the chickadees, would benefit from the care he put into this small thing. Evening came and Frank made a real dinner, pork chops and mashed potatoes and green beans from a can. He ate at the kitchen table instead of standing at the counter, sat in his chair. Instead of Mary's, and it felt like movement, small movement, barely perceptible, but movement forward instead of the endless circling he had been doing for 5 years. The phone rang again at 8 o'clock. Frank answered, half expecting silence. Mr. Donovan, Claire's voice quiet and shaking. Yes. Claire, are you okay? Can I talk to you? Not now. I'm at work still, but tomorrow could I come by? You gave me Pastor Butler's number, but I don't know him and I need to talk to someone who understands. Frank's chest tightened. Of course. Anytime. You know where I live. Tommy drew a map from the library. Your cabin is on County Road 47, right? The blue truck. That's me. Come by whenever you're ready. Door's always open. Thank you. She hung up before he could say anything else, but in those 2 words, Frank heard a lifetime of exhaustion and the beginning of something that might be hope or might just be desperation. He sat up late that night, watching snow fall in the darkness outside his window, turning the world white and clean. Tomorrow Claire would come. Tomorrow he'd have to find words for things he barely understood himself, how to help without taking over, how to protect, without controlling, how to be strong enough to stand between someone and danger, without being so strong that he became the new danger. The cabin was cold, but Frank didn't turn up the heater. He sat in the dark in the silence, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the breath before speech, the moment before action, the pause before everything changed. In the morning, he would clean the cabin, make coffee that didn't taste like rust, be ready for Claire and whatever she carried with her, fear or hope or something between. Be ready to be the kind of man Mary had believed he could be, the kind his mother had needed, the kind his father never was. The snow continued to fall, erasing the old tracks, covering the familiar world in something new. Frank watched it until exhaustion pulled him towards sleep. And even in dreams, he felt the weight of what was coming, the responsibility of being noticed, of being asked for help, of having to decide whether honor was just a word you said or a thing you did when the world wasn't watching. Tomorrow. Tomorrow it would begin. Sunday morning came wrapped in white silence, snow covering the cabin roof and muffling the world into something hushed and waiting. Frank woke before dawn, cleaned the kitchen until the counters gleamed, swept floors that hadn't seen a broom in weeks, even wiped down the windows, though no one would notice. The effort wasn't about Claire seeing a tidy house. It was about having something to do with his hands while his mind raced through scenarios he couldn't control. She arrived at 10 driving a Honda Civic that had more rust than paint, Tommy in the passenger seat, with his sketch pad clutched against his chest like armor. Frank watched from the window as Claire sat in the driver's seat for a full minute after turning off the engine, hands gripping the steering wheel, gathering courage or resolve, or whatever it took to walk into a stranger's house and ask for help. He opened the door before she could knock, stepping out onto the porch in his wool-lined jacket. Morning, cold one. Claire managed a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you for seeing us. Tommy waved from beside his mother, shy but curious, taking in the cabin and the workshop and the snow-covered truck with the attention of a kid who filed away details for later drawings. Come in. Got coffee on hot chocolate for Tommy if he wants. The interior of the cabin must have looked spare to them, functional furniture worn smooth by decades of use, walls bare except for the wedding photo, and a few landscapes Mary had picked up at yard sales. No television visible from the main room. No clutter. The home of a man who'd stopped accumulating things when he'd lost the person he was accumulating them for. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, posture rigid, ready to bolt. Tommy wandered to the bookshelf, running fingers along spines of military histories and westerns, the literary diet of a man who'd lived through one kind of story and escaped into another. Frank brought mugs, coffee for Claire, hot chocolate for Tommy, nothing for himself because his stomach was too tight to handle anything. He settled into the recliner across from them, giving Claire space to speak or not speak, whatever she needed. She held the mug in both hands, staring into it like the steam held answers. The bruise on her jawline looked worse in natural light, purple-black and swollen, despite the makeup she tried to hide it with. Her left wrist bore a matching set of finger-shaped marks, the kind that came from being grabbed hard and held there. I don't know where to start. Anywhere's fine. No rush. Tommy had found a book about World War II aircraft and was flipping through it, absorbed in pictures of B-17 bombers and P-51 Mustangs, giving his mother the privacy of divided attention. Wade, Mr. Carson, he wasn't always like this. When I first got hired 3 years ago, he was okay. Gruff but fair, paid on time, didn't ask questions about my past. That mattered because I was running from Tommy's father. She paused, sipped coffee. She probably couldn't taste marshaling words that had been trapped too long. Ryan, my ex-husband, he was a cop in Boise. Good one at first, then he got hurt on duty, back injury. They put him on painkillers. OxyContin. 6 months later, he couldn't function without them. A year later, he'd lost his job, blown through our savings, started borrowing from people you don't borrow from unless you're desperate or stupid or both. The loan sharks worse. Other cops who'd gone dirty, they loaned him $15,000 at 30% interest compounded monthly. Ryan couldn't pay it back. Started stealing from me, from his parents, from anyone. I took Tommy and left when Ryan came home high and broke my ribs because I'd hidden the grocery money. Tommy didn't look up from his book, but his shoulders had gone rigid the way children freeze when adults discuss the traumas they're not supposed to know about, but absolutely do. That was 2 years ago. I got the divorce finalized, moved to Oak Ridge because it was small and far enough from Boise that I thought we'd be safe. Wade hired me without checking references too closely, which I needed because Ryan had tanked my credit and I couldn't afford background checks that might show up in databases. And Wade changed when 6 months in. Started making comments about how I should be grateful for the ball, how no one else would hire someone with my situation. Then the comments became touches, hand on my shoulder, standing too close, brushing against me in the kitchen. When I pulled away, he got angry. Said I was ungrateful, that he'd done me a favor and I owed him. She set down the mug, hands shaking too much to hold it steady. First time he hit me was 8 months ago. I'd refused to stay late and help him with inventory. He slapped me, said I needed to learn respect. I should have left then, should have reported him, but he knew about Ryan, about the debt. He said he had connections in Boise, said he could let Ryan know where I was if I made trouble. So you stayed. So I stayed. And it got worse. The hits became more frequent. The comments became threats. He docks my pay for imaginary mistakes, makes me work double shifts without overtime, touches me in the kitchen when no one's looking. And I take it, because leaving means finding another job, which means references, which means questions I can't answer. And because Wade made good on his threat last month, he called someone in Boise, told them where I was. Ryan showed up here 2 weeks ago. Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. What happened? Ryan came to the diner, high as a kite, demanding money, saying I owed him for destroying his life. Wade kicked him out, but not before Ryan saw Tommy. Not before Ryan said he'd be back, that he had rights as a father, that he'd take Tommy if I didn't pay off his debt. How much does Ryan owe? $40,000 now, with interest. Might as well be $40 million. I make $12 an hour, Frank. After rent and food and Tommy's clothes, there's nothing left. I've been trying to save, but Wade keeps cutting my hours, then threatening to fire me if I complain. Tommy finally looked up from his book, eyes too old for his face. Mom cries at night. I hear her through the wall. Claire's face crumpled. She pressed both hands to her mouth, holding back sobs that wanted to escape. Frank felt something crack in his chest, that old protective instinct that had made him stand between his mother and his father, that had made him volunteer for Vietnam because someone had to stand between the innocent and the violent. He crossed to the couch, sat down beside Claire with careful distance, not touching, but present. Listen to me. What's happening isn't your fault. Wade is responsible for Wade's actions. Ryan is responsible for Ryan's. You didn't cause this. You're surviving it, which takes more strength than most people have. But I feel so weak. Weakness would be giving up. Weakness would be hurting Tommy because you couldn't handle the pressure. You're here asking for help. That's courage. Tommy came over, wrapped his arms around his mother's shoulders. She pulled him close, face buried in his hair, and they sat like that while snow continued to fall outside and the cabin held them in its spare warmth. When Claire could speak again, her voice came steadier. Pastor Butler's name, you gave it to me. Can he really help raise a good man? Best I know, church has resources, shelter space, legal aid, volunteers, connections to social services. More important, Ray knows how to keep things quiet until you're ready to make them loud. What do you mean right now Wade has power because you're isolated? No support system, no witnesses, no one who'll back up your story if you report him? We change that by building a network around you. People who know what's happening, who'll testify if needed, who'll provide shelter and legal help and whatever else it takes. But Wade has connections too. The sheriff's deputies eat free at the diner. Then we go over their heads if we have to. State police, FBI if Ryan's dirty cop friends are involved. But first we document everything. Photos of bruises, written timeline of abuse, medical records if you've seen a doctor. I haven't, couldn't afford it, and going to the clinic meant questions. We'll fix that. Ray knows a doctor who volunteers at the church. She'll examine you, document injuries, create a record that'll hold up in court. Tommy pulled back from his mother, looked at Frank with an expression that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. Are you going to protect us? Like the man in my drawing, the question landed heavy. Frank met the boy's eyes, saw his own son at that age, remembered all the promises he'd made, and broken all the ways he'd failed to be the father David needed. I'm going to do everything I can, but protection isn't just one person. It's a community deciding together that what's happening to your mom is wrong and needs to stop. I'm part of that community. Pastor Butler is. Others will be. You won't face this alone anymore. Claire wiped her eyes, smearing mascara but not caring. Why are you helping us? You don't know me. Don't owe me anything. Frank stood, walked to the window, looked out at the snow-covered yard where nothing moved and everything waited. I had a wife, Mary. She died 5 years ago, cancer. Before she passed, she made me promise something, that I'd use whatever honor I had to help people who needed it. I broke that promise for a long time. Sat in this cabin feeling sorry for myself while the world kept spinning. Then I saw your bruises, and I remembered my mother remembered what it looked like when someone was trapped and scared and had nowhere to turn. I can't save my mother, she's been gone 30 years. Can't save my marriage, Mary's grave doesn't need my regrets. But maybe I can help you. And maybe that's what Mary meant. Maybe honor isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up when someone needs you to. Tommy returned to his book, but Claire stayed on the couch, staring at Frank with an expression he couldn't quite read. Your son. You mentioned him yesterday at the library. Where is he, Saddle? Has a wife, 2 kids of his own. Haven't spoken to him in 8 years. Why not? Same reason a lot of fathers lose their sons. Pride. Stubbornness. An idea of manhood so rigid it broke under the weight of real life. David wanted to go to business school. I wanted him to be a carpenter like me. We fought about it. Said things we shouldn't have. He went to Seattle, got married, built a life. I stayed here being right instead of being his father. Have you tried calling him? Every day I think about it. Every day I pick up the phone and can't dial. Afraid of what he'll say. Afraid he won't say anything at all. Maybe he's afraid too. Maybe he's waiting for you to reach out. Maybe. Or maybe some bridges burned too far to rebuild. Claire walked to where Frank stood by the window. My father died when I was 16. Heart attack. Last thing I said to him was that I hated him because he wouldn't let me go to a concert. Stupid teenage stuff. Then he was gone and I never got to take it back. If your son is alive, if there's any chance, don't wait until you can't call anymore. The words hit like physical force. Frank turned doorway, throat too tight to respond. Tommy saved the moment by announcing he was hungry and the tension broke into the practical logistics of lunch. They ate sandwiches at the kitchen table, turkey and cheese, nothing fancy, but Tommy devoured his like he hadn't eaten in days. Probably hadn't eaten well in days, Frank realized, if Claire's budget was as tight as she'd indicated. The boy had that wiry thinness that came from growing fast on not quite enough calories. After lunch, Frank showed Tommy the workshop while Claire used the bathroom to clean up the smeared makeup. The garage smelled like old sawdust and motor oil, familiar and comforting. Tommy's eyes went wide at the tools hanging on pegboard, at the half-finished birdhouse on the workbench, at the larger projects in various states of completion. You made all this over 40 years. Built furniture cabinets, whole houses sometimes. This was my job before I retired. Tommy touched the birdhouse with reverent fingers. Can you teach me? Frank felt something warm expand in his chest, something he hadn't felt since David was young, and asked the same question. Sure. Hand me that sandpaper there, the fine grit, the tan paper. We'll smooth these edges so no bird gets a splinter. They worked in comfortable silence, Tommy following Frank's instructions with the focused attention of a child who'd learned to find sanctuary in quiet concentration. Frank showed him how to sand with the grain, how to test smoothness with your fingertips, how to blow away dust instead of wiping it so you didn't grind particles into the wood. When Claire emerged from the house, face clean and eyes less swollen, she found them bent over the workbench together, Tommy chattering about comic book heroes, while Frank nodded and offered the occasional comment. She stood in the doorway watching, and something in her expression made Frank think of Mary, of the way she used to watch him teach David, pride and sadness mixed together, because she knew time moved fast, and boys grew up, and moments like this couldn't be preserved except in memory. The afternoon wore on. Claire called Wade to let him know she was sick, couldn't make her evening shift. Frank listened to her lie with practiced ease, that particular skill of abuse survivors who learn to manage their abusers through careful manipulation of truth. When she hung up, her hands were shaking, but her voice had been steady. He believed you. He was drunk. Always is by Sunday afternoon. He'll be angry tomorrow, but at least it buys us time. Ray's expecting us at the church. You ready? The drive into town took 20 minutes, chains on the tires grinding against packed snow. Tommy sat him back, still clutching his sketch pad, drawing something Frank couldn't see. Claire rode in silence, staring out the window at a landscape she'd lived in for 3 years, but maybe never really seen, too busy surviving to notice beauty. Oak Ridge Baptist Church looked warm against the white lights glowing in the windows, smoke rising from the chimney of the community building out back. Ray met them at the door, dressed in casual clothes, now jeans and a flannel sweater that made him look more like somebody's grandfather than a pastor. Claire, Tommy, come in out of the cold. He ushered them through the sanctuary into his office, a cluttered space that smelled like old books and coffee. Dr. Ellen Martinez was already there, a woman in her late 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a bun and the calm competence of someone who'd seen worse and survived to help others through it. The introductions were brief. Ray explained that Ellen volunteered at the church's health clinic, that she'd examine Claire if Claire consented, that everything would be documented and confidential unless Claire chose to make it public. Claire agreed. Tommy stayed with Frank and Ray in the main office while Ellen took Claire to the clinic space in the back building. The examination took 40 minutes. When they returned, Claire looked exhausted but somehow lighter, as if having someone official acknowledge the reality of her injuries made them real in a way they hadn't been before. Ellen's report was clinical and damning. Multiple contusions in various stages of healing. Bruising consistent with manual strangulation attempt, approximately 2 weeks old. Defensive wounds on forearms. Psychological indicators of sustained trauma and hypervigilance. Frank's hands clenched into fists. Ray noticed placed a calming hand on his shoulder. The next step is legal. Linda Oakes, she's a retired lawyer, does pro bono work for the church. She can help Claire file for a restraining order against Wade, possibly against Ryan too, if we can prove he's been threatening her. That won't stop Wade from retaliating at work. She'll lose her job, which is why we have Plan B. The church community has been looking for someone to manage the Sunday school program and coordinate volunteers. It's 20 hours a week, pays $15 an hour. Not enough to live on, but combined with the shelter space we can provide. You have shelter space, Ray nodded. Small apartment above the church community center, 2 bedrooms, kitchen, bathroom. It's not fancy, but it's safe and it's free. Claire and Tommy can stay there while we figured out the next steps. Claire had been listening with growing disbelief. Why would you do all this for us? Ray's expression softened. Because that's what church is supposed to be. Not just Sunday services and hymns. It's community taking care of community. You need help. We have help to give. The math is simple. Tommy tugged on Frank's sleeve. Will you still teach me woodworking if we move to the church every week? Promise. The boy smiled, and for the first time since Frank had met him, the smile reached his eyes. They spent another hour working out logistics. Claire would finish her shift Monday, then give Wade 2 weeks' notice professional courtesy that would actually just be a protective measure, so he couldn't claim she'd abandoned her job. During those 2 weeks, she'd move gradually into the church apartment, a few boxes at a time, not enough to tip off Wade that she was leaving permanently. Linda Oakes would file the restraining order on Wednesday timed, so Wade would be served at the diner during business hours with witnesses present. For Ryan, the plan was more complicated. Sheriff Tom Harris. Ray made a point of distinguishing him from the deputies who ate free at Wade's diner. Was a good man, honest someone who'd actually help if given evidence. Ray would meet with Harris privately, show him Ellen's medical report, explain the situation. If Ryan had active warrants in Idaho, Harris could arrange to have him picked up the next time he crossed into Oregon. The sun was setting by the time they left the church, the temperature dropping fast. Frank drove Claire and Tommy back to their trailer on the outskirts of town, a single wide that had been manufactured sometime in the 70s and had been falling apart ever since. The interior was clean, but sparse secondhand furniture and a space heater struggling against the cold. I'll help you move tomorrow, after your shift. Claire shook her head. You've done enough, more than enough. It's not enough until you're safe. Let me help Claire. Please, calm. She relented, not at exhaustion, winning over pride. Tommy was already curling up on the couch with a blanket that had cartoon characters from a decade ago. Frank left them there and drove home through darkness, absolute, the kind of black that only exists in mountain towns far from city lights. The cabin welcomed him back with cold indifference, but he didn't mind. He had purpose now. Had a reason to wake up tomorrow that didn't involve just filling time until death arrived. Monday morning he was at the diner when Claire started her shift. Took booth 7, ordered his usual, watched Wade move through the restaurant with the swagger of a small man given too much power over too many people. The breakfast crowd was thick loggers and truckers and the Monday morning regulars who couldn't start the week without bacon and eggs. Claire brought Frank's coffee with steady hands. Their eyes met for half a second, a moment of shared understanding, then she moved on to the next table. Professional, unremarkable, just another Monday in a life that was about to change completely. Wade emerged from the kitchen, carrying a bus tub, surveying his domain. His gaze lingered on Frank's suspicion, sharpening his features. You're here a lot lately, old man. Food's good. Food's the same as it's been for 30 years. So why the sudden interest? Retired? Got time on my hands. This seems like a good place to spend it. Wade set down the bus tub hard enough to make plates rattle. Long as you're spending money, not just wasting space. This is a business, not a homeless shelter. I pay for what I order. Always leave a good tip. That a problem? Wade held his stare for a long moment, clearly wanting to say more, but aware that throwing out a paying customer would raise questions he couldn't afford. Finally, he grunted and retreated to the kitchen. Frank finished his breakfast slowly, making the meal last until the morning rush ended and the diner emptied. Claire approached with a coffee pot to top him off. He knows something's different. He can feel it. 2 more days. Wednesday, the restraining order gets filed. You just have to make it 2 more days. Her jaw set with determination. I can do 2 days. She moved to clear his plate, but Frank stopped her with a gentle touch on her arm, the one without bruises. You're stronger than you think. Don't forget that. Wade's voice cracked across the diner like a whip, Claire kitchen, and she flinched but walked toward the kitchen with her head high. Frank watched her disappear through the door, heard Wade's voice rise in anger about something trivial, something manufactured to justify the rage he needed to express. The door swung shut, and Frank was left with other customers' curious glances and his own impotent anger. He paid his check, left $30 on a $15 meal, and drove to the church where Ray was already meeting with Sheriff Harris. The sheriff was a tall man in his early 60s with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent their career dealing with the worst humanity had to offer, but somehow hadn't let it make him cruel. Frank. Ray's told me about the situation with Claire Montgomery and Wade Carson. I've known Wade was trouble for years, but never had evidence solid enough to act on. This medical report changes things. Harris held up Ellen's documentation photographs of Claire's injuries printed on white paper that somehow made the violence more stark, more undeniable. The restraining order will be served Wednesday morning at the diner. I'll do it myself with 2 deputies, make sure there are plenty of witnesses so Wade can't claim it never happened. Once the order is in place, if Wade comes within 500 feet of Claire or Tommy, he goes to jail. And Ryan Montgomery Harris pulled up something on his computer, turned the screen so Frank could see. Arrest warrant out of Ada County, Idaho. Possession with intent to distribute, failure to appear, violating terms of parole. If Ryan crosses into Oregon, I can pick him up and extradite him back to Idaho. He'll be their problem, not Claire's. That's simple. Nothing's ever simple. But yeah, if we can find him, we can arrest him. I've got his last known address, vehicle description. Known associates. I've already sent out a bolo. Be on the lookout to all the agencies in the region. Someone spots him, we'll know. Frank felt something unclench in his chest. This was what competence looked like, people who knew what they were doing, who had authority and willingness to use it. He'd been carrying this alone, or thought he had, but now he saw the network Ray had built, the community responding. Thank you, Sheriff. Harris extended his hand. Thank Claire. She's the one who had the courage to come forward. We can't help people who won't ask for help. You did good getting her to ask. After Harris left, Frank helped Ray sort through boxes of donated clothes for the church's charity distribution. The work was mindless, sorting by size and season, but it gave them something to do with their hands while they talked through contingencies. What if Wade doesn't accept the restraining order? What if he comes after Claire anyway? Then he violates a court order and goes to jail. Simple as that. Men like Wade don't think consequences apply to them. He's been getting away with this for years. A piece of paper won't change his behavior overnight. Ray folded a child's jacket, added it to the appropriate pile. Maybe not, but it changes what we can do about his behavior. Right now, he operates in shadows. We're dragging him into light. Some men crumble under scrutiny, and the ones who don't, the question hung between them. Ray's expression went somber. Then we escalate. Police protection. Move Claire somewhere Wade can't find her. Whatever it takes. But Frank, you can't do this alone. You're 67 years old. Wade's 20 years younger and mean besides. If it comes to physical confrontation, it won't. We're going to be smarter than that. Ray looked skeptical but didn't push. They finished sorting clothes in silence. Frank spent Monday evening at the library helping Tommy with homework while Claire worked her shift. The boy struggled with long division but excelled at reading comprehension, devouring books about explorers and inventors and people who'd changed the world through persistence and courage. You like stories about heroes. Tommy looked up from his math worksheet. Don't you used to? Nowadays, I'm not sure heroes exist, just people doing what they can with what they've got. Isn't that what a hero is? Someone who does what they can, even when it's hard. The question was too insightful for an 8-year-old. Frank wondered what Tommy had already survived, what he'd already witnessed to develop that kind of understanding so young. Maybe you're right. Maybe heroes are just people who don't look away. That's what you are. You didn't look away from Mom. Frank felt his throat tighten. I'm just an old man with nothing better to do. Tommy shook his head, certain in the way only children could be certain. You're a hero. I'm going to draw you one. When we move to the church apartment, I'm going to draw a picture of you and put it on my wall. The simple declaration shouldn't have carried the weight it did, but Frank felt it settle on his shoulders like a responsibility he couldn't refuse. To this boy, he was becoming something more than a neighbor helping out. He was becoming the standard Tommy would measure other men against. The pressure of that made Frank think of David, of all the ways he'd failed to be the father his son needed. Later, after he'd driven Tommy home to the trailer, where Claire was waiting with the kind of exhausted relief that said her shift had been brutal, Frank sat in his truck in the church parking lot and pulled out his phone. He stared at David's contact information, thumb hovering over the call button. 3 times he almost pressed it. 3 times his pride or fear or some combination stopped him. He thought about Claire's words. If your son is alive, if there's any chance, don't wait until you can't call anymore. But the distance between wanting to call and actually calling remained unbridgeable. He drove home through cold that had gone from uncomfortable to dangerous, the kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes in engines if you weren't careful. Tuesday passed in anxious waiting. Frank stopped by the diner again, took his usual booth, watched Wade move through the space with increasing agitation. Something had him on edge. Maybe he sensed the noose tightening. Maybe the universe had its own way of warning predators when prey was about to escape. Claire worked with robotic efficiency, no wasted movement, no unnecessary interaction with customers. She was counting hours now, Frank could tell. 48 hours until the restraining order. 48 hours until she could start dismantling the cage she'd been living in. Wade cornered her by the coffee station. Frank couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read body language. Wade leaning in too close, Claire leaning back. Wade's hand shooting out to grab her arm. She twisted free, said something sharp, and Wade's face went dark with rage. Frank was moving before he decided to move, crossing the diner in 4 strides. Wade saw him coming, released Claire, stepped back with hands raised in mock innocence. Everything okay here? Fine, just discussing schedule changes. Wade's smile was all teeth, no warmth. Isn't that right, Claire? Claire's eyes met Frank's for half a second, a plea and a warning mixed together. She needed him to back down, to not escalate, to give her 48 more hours. Frank held Wade's stare long enough to make his point, then returned to booth 7. But something had shifted. Wade knew now, or suspected, that Claire had allies. The knowledge made him more dangerous, not less. That night, Frank couldn't sleep, lay in bed watching shadows move across the ceiling, listening to wind howl around the cabin's corners. His phone sat on the nightstand, David's contact information still queued up from earlier. The distance to his son felt simultaneously like 8 years and 800 miles, close enough to touch, but too far to reach. At 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with Mary's wedding ring. He'd never been able to make himself bury it with her. The gold had worn thin in places where she'd worn it for 37 years. He turned it over in his fingers, remembering the day he'd placed it on her hand, young and stupid, with promises he'd only partially kept. Use your honor to help people, Frank. That's what duty means. Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear. Frank was at the church by 7, helping Claire load the last boxes from her trailer into Ray's van. Tommy sat in the back seat, quiet and watchful, clutching his sketch pad. Everything they owned fit in 2 carloads, closed books, a few toys. Kitchen supplies. The accumulation of 3 years in Oak Ridge, a whole life condensed to essentials. At 9:30, Sheriff Harris pulled up to the Oak Ridge family diner in his patrol vehicle, 2 deputies following in a second car. Frank watched from his truck across the street, engine running, heat blasting. Through the diner's windows, he could see Wade moving between tables, oblivious to what was coming. Harris and the deputies entered. The conversation was brief and professional. Harris presented the restraining order. Wade's face went from confusion to disbelief to rage in the span of seconds. His voice carried through the glass, shouting, threatening, demanding to know who'd filed the complaint. The deputies moved to flank him, hands resting on their belts, a subtle reminder that cooperation wasn't optional. Wade signed the acknowledgement with a pen that he threw hard enough to crack against the wall. As the sheriff and deputies left, Wade stood in the middle of his diner alone with his fury, and even from across the street, Frank could see the moment Wade's mind started calculating revenge. Frank pulled out his phone. This time he didn't hesitate. didn't let pride or fear stop him. He pressed call on David's contact information and lifted the phone to his ear, listening to it ring once, twice, three times. A voice answered, cautious and hesitant. "Hello, David. It's your father." Silence on the other end long enough that Frank thought the connection had dropped. "Then, Dad, is that really you?" "Yeah, it's me. I know I should have called sooner, but I'm calling now, and I need to tell you something I should have said 8 years ago." The words came harder than facing Wade ever could, but Frank forced them out anyway because courage wasn't just standing between danger and the vulnerable. Sometimes courage was admitting you'd been wrong, asking for forgiveness, reaching across distance you'd created yourself. "I'm sorry for everything, for being too stubborn to let you live your own life, for choosing pride over my son, for not calling when your mom died." "I'm sorry, David." Another silence, then a sound that might have been crying or laughing or both. "I've been waiting 8 years to hear you say that." Across the street, Wade Carson stood in his diner window, staring directly at Frank's truck, with an expression that promised this wasn't over. But Frank barely noticed. He was talking to his son for the first time in 8 years, and in that moment, everything else could wait. The war with Wade was just beginning. But Frank had remembered something important. You don't fight battles alone. You fight them with community, with family, with people who believe the same things you believe about right and wrong and what matters. Wednesday afternoon passed in a blur of logistics and emotion. Frank talked to David for 2 hours, catching up on 8 years in a conversation that jumped between apology and forgiveness and updates on grandchildren Frank had never met. David promised to visit within the month, to bring Sarah and Emma and Liam, to give Frank a chance to be the grandfather he'd never been. When Frank finally hung up, his face was wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. Ray found him in the church parking lot, sitting in his truck, with the engine off, staring at nothing. "You okay?" Frank nodded. "Called my son. First time in 8 years. Ray's expression softened with understanding. "How'd it go?" "Better than I deserved. He's coming to visit, bringing the grandkids." "That's good, Frank, really good." But the moment of peace shattered when Ray's phone buzzed with a text. His face went pale. "That's Sheriff Harris." Wade closed the diner early, told staff to leave. Harris sent a deputy to check on him. "Wade's gone, truck's gone. No one knows where he is." Frank's blood went cold. "Claire and Tommy, they're safe, at the church apartment. Harris is sending a patrol car to watch the building." "But Frank, Wade knows where you live. You helped Claire. In his mind, you're responsible for this. Let him come. I'll be ready." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." The patrol car sat in the church parking lot with its engine idling, exhaust puffing white in the late afternoon cold. Deputy Martinez, a young woman with sharp eyes and the kind of alertness that came from taking the job seriously, had positioned herself where she could see both the apartment entrance and the main road. Frank pulled up beside her, rolled down his window. "Claire and Tommy settled in okay." Martinez nodded. "Tommy's doing homework. Claire's unpacking boxes. She seems, I don't know, relieved but scared, like she's waiting for the other shoe to drop. That's because it probably will." Wade's not the type to accept consequences quietly. "Sheriff Harris briefed me, said Wade's vehicle was last seen heading east on Highway 22. Could be running, could be circling back. We're checking known associates' places he might hole up." "What about Ryan Montgomery?" Martinez consulted her notepad. "No movement on that front. Last confirmed sighting was 2 weeks ago at a gas station in Bend. Could be he's lying low, could be he's left the state. We've got alerts out, but nothing's pinged yet." Frank thanked her and headed inside, climbing the narrow stairs to the apartment above the community center. The space was exactly as Ray had described, small but functional 2 bedrooms separated by a living area that combined kitchen and sitting room. Claire had already made progress organizing boxes stacked along one wall, Tommy's drawings taped to the refrigerator. The boy sat at a folding table, pencil moving across paper with focused intensity. He looked up when Frank entered, face brightening. "Mr. Frank, look what I'm working on." He turned the sketchpad around. The drawing showed a church with a man standing guard outside, one hand raised in greeting, the other resting on. Frank leaned closer. "A hammer. No, the shape was wrong. A gavel maybe, or it's you. You're protecting the church. That's your truck, and that's your hand waving at Deputy Martinez." The detail was remarkable for an 8-year-old, the proportions slightly off, but the essence captured perfectly. Frank felt something tighten in his throat. That's really good, Tommy. You've got real talent. Mom says talent is just practice in disguise. Says if I keep drawing every day, I'll get even better. Your mom's a smart woman. Claire emerged from one of the bedrooms, hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her diner uniform. Without the costume of work, she looked younger, less burdened, though her eyes still carried that hypervigilance that wouldn't fade overnight. Frank, thanks for checking on us. Just wanted to make sure you're comfortable. Need anything? She glanced around the apartment, seeming to really see it for the first time. A place that was hers, not Wade's, not shared with memories of Ryan. Clean walls, working heat locks on the doors. We're good. Better than good. This is more than I hoped for. Tommy abandoned his drawing, came over to tug on Frank's sleeve. Are you staying for dinner? Mom's making spaghetti. It's my favorite. Frank looked to Claire for permission. She smiled, tentative but genuine, and nodded. Please stay. It's the least I can do after everything. They ate at the small table with mismatched chairs, Tommy chattering about his day at school, while Claire and Frank maintained careful conversation around the edges of the boys' attention. The spaghetti was simple, but good, made better by the company, by the sense of something fragile being built in this temporary space. After dinner, Tommy returned to his drawings while Frank helped Claire wash dishes. They worked in companionable silence, the mundane ritual of cleaning up feeling almost sacred in its normalcy. Through the window, they could see Deputy Martinez still in her patrol car, steady presence against the darkness gathering outside. Do you think Wade will try something? Claire's question came quiet, almost afraid to be spoken aloud. Honestly, yeah, men like Wade don't take well to being told no, especially not publicly. The restraining order humiliated him. He'll want to restore his powers somehow. Should I be scared? Frank dried a plate, set it carefully in the cupboard. Being cautious is smart. Being paralyzed by fear is what Wade wants. You've already shown you're stronger than he gave you credit for. Don't let him take that away now. Claire turned off the faucet, stood staring out the window at the dark. After Ryan, after everything he put me through, I promised myself I'd never let another man control my life. Then Wade happened and I just fell back into the same patterns, accepting the abuse because leaving seemed harder than staying. You got out. That's what matters. But what if I hadn't met you? What if you hadn't noticed, hadn't cared? I'd still be there, still trapped, still making excuses for why I couldn't leave. Frank dried another plate, choosing his words carefully. I think you would have found a way eventually. Maybe not as soon, maybe not as safely, but you've got steel in you, Claire. I saw it. That first day, the way you kept going despite everything, that's not something Wade put there. That's yours. She smiled, slight but real, then returned to washing the remaining dishes. They finished in silence that felt less heavy than before, less like they were carrying separate burdens and more like they were sharing the weight. Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch by 9 o'clock, sketch pad open across his chest, pencil still in hand. Claire carried him to his bedroom with the practiced ease of a mother who'd done this countless times. When she returned, Frank was standing by the door preparing to leave. Thank you for everything. I know I keep saying it, but you don't have to thank me. Just stay safe. Keep the doors locked. Martinez will be outside all night, but if anything feels wrong, you call 911 immediately. Don't wait. Don't second guess yourself. I will. And Frank, your son, David, I'm glad you called him. Me too. The drive back to his cabin took 20 minutes through darkness so complete it felt tangible. Frank kept checking his rearview mirror, looking for headlights that might be following, but the road stayed empty behind him. The paranoia felt justified. Wade knew where he lived, had motive and means for retaliation. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he turned onto County Road 47, then onto the gravel drive that led to his property. The cabin looked exactly as he'd left it, undisturbed, surrounded by woods that held their own silence. Frank did a full perimeter check before going inside, examining windows for signs of tampering, checking the workshop door, making sure nothing had been moved or disturbed. Everything appeared normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Inside, he locked the door and pulled the shotgun from the hall closet, a Remington 870 he'd bought decades ago for hunting and hadn't fired in years. He checked the chamber, loaded it with buckshot, and propped it against the wall by his bed. The weight of it there, the knowledge that violence might become necessary, sat heavy in his chest. Sleep came in fragments, broken by every sound, the cabin-made wood settling wind against windows, branches scraping the roof. Each time Frank jerked awake, heart pounding, hand reaching for the shotgun that waited in the darkness. By dawn, he'd managed maybe 3 hours of actual rest, the remainder spent in that liminal state between consciousness and dreams where past and present blurred together. Thursday morning, he drove into town before sunrise, passing the diner, which sat dark and locked Wade's truck. Nowhere in sight. Sheriff Harris had left a message overnight, still no sign of Wade, but they'd located his mother's house in Bend and had local police checking it. Ryan Montgomery remained similarly elusive, last known location 2 weeks old and growing colder. At the church, Frank found Ray already in his office, reading through documents that looked legal and complicated. The pastor looked up, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes. Linda Oakes filed additional paperwork yesterday. If Wade doesn't show up for his court date next month, the restraining order becomes permanent and he faces contempt charges. If he does show up, he'll have to answer questions about the assault under oath. And if he decides to skip court and go after Claire directly, Ray set down the papers, removed his reading glasses. Then we failed her, which is why we're not going to let that happen. How do you propose we stop a man who's already proven he doesn't care about rules of community? Visibility, making it impossible for Wade to act without witnesses. Claire's schedule is public now. Church in the morning, helping with the Sunday school setup lunch at the community center. Afternoons at the library with Tommy. She's never alone. There are always people around, always eyes watching. That only works if Wade cares about witnesses. Some men are too far gone for that. Then we pray he's not one of them, and we prepare for the possibility that he is. The conversation was interrupted by Frank's phone buzzing. David's name appeared on the screen, and even after yesterday's breakthrough, seeing it still caused a flutter of anxiety in Frank's chest. Dad just checking in. You sounded stressed yesterday. Everything okay? Frank stepped outside for privacy, the morning cold biting through his jacket. Helping a friend with some trouble. Nothing I can't handle. That's what you always said, right before you handled it alone and ended up in over your head. The observation stung because it was accurate. Frank had always operated under the assumption that asking for help was weakness, that real men solved their own problems without dragging others into the mess. It was the same philosophy that had driven David away. You're right, I'm trying to do better about that. Learn from past mistakes. Good. Listen, Sarah and I are planning to drive down next weekend. She's already excited to see Oak Ridge, says she wants to meet this community you're building. And the kids? Emma's already drawn you about 12 pictures. Something warm expanded in Frank's chest, pushing back against the cold and stress. That would be good. Really good. We'll stay at a hotel. Don't want to impose, no. Stay at the cabin, please. It's not much, but there's room. I want to show you where I've been living, where your mom and I built our life. Silence on the other end. Then David's voice came thick with emotion. Okay, Dad, we'd like that. They talked for another 10 minutes planning logistics, David sharing stories about Emma's latest school project and Liam's obsession with dinosaurs. Normal family conversation, the kind Frank had been starving for without realizing it. When they finally hung up, Frank stood in the church parking lot watching sun break over the mountains, and for the first time in 5 years felt something other than regret when thinking about family. The feeling lasted until Ray came running out of the church, phone in hand, face pale. That was Martinez. Someone broke into Claire's trailer last night, tore the place apart. Sheriff thinks it was Wade. Did he take anything? Not that they can tell. But he left a message. Spray painted on the bedroom wall, you can't hide. Frank's blood went cold. We need to get to Claire. Now, they found her in the apartment with Tommy, both of them pale and shaken. Sheriff Harris stood in the kitchen taking notes while Deputy Martinez hovered near the door. Claire sat on the couch, arms wrapped around herself, that old familiar posture of making herself small. He knows where we were. He went through our things, our home, your old home. Frank sat down beside her, careful to maintain distance. He can't touch you here. The restraining order keeps him 500 feet away, and this building is always occupied. He'd have to be crazy to try anything. Maybe he is crazy. Maybe I drove him to it by numb. Frank's voice came firm enough to cut through her spiral. Wade's choices are Wade's responsibility. You didn't drive him to anything. He chose to abuse you. He chose to break into your trailer. Those are his decisions, his consequences. Sheriff Harris closed his notebook. We've got units checking Wade's known locations. His mother claims she hasn't seen him, but we're not taking her word for it. The break-in at the trailer gives us additional charges if we find him breaking and entering vandalism violation of the restraining order. He's digging himself deeper. Unless he runs, leaves Oregon entirely. Harris shook his head. Men like Wade don't run, they escalate, which is why Deputy Martinez will be stationed here 24/7 until we have Wade in custody. And Frank, you should consider staying somewhere else for a few days. Wade knows you helped Claire. You might be a target too. I'm not running from my own home. It's not running, it's being strategic. Frank stood jaw set. I've got a shotgun and 45 years of stubbornness. Wade wants to come at me, he's welcome to try. Ray walked Frank out to his truck, concern evident in his expression. You're letting anger make you reckless. That's not honor. That's pride. Maybe it's both. But I'm not going to hide while Wade terrorizes people. Someone needs to draw a line. Drawing lines is the sheriff's job. Your job is staying alive long enough to see your grandchildren next weekend. The words hit harder than expected. Frank leaned against his truck, feeling the weight of everything pressing down Claire's fear. Tommy's vulnerability, Wade's escalating violence, Ryan's lurking threat. And underneath it all, the fragile reconnection with David that could be destroyed if Frank did something stupid and got himself killed. What would you do? In my position, Ray considered the question. I'd trust the system. Let Harris do his job. Focus on supporting Claire and Tommy without putting myself in the line of fire. And if the system fails, if Harris doesn't find Wade before Wade finds Claire, then we deal with that when it happens. Together, not with you playing lone vigilante at 67 years old. Frank nodded, acknowledging the wisdom, even if he wasn't sure he could follow it. The drive back to his cabin felt longer than usual. Every curve in the road, a potential ambush point. Every shadow between trees, a possible threat. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his shoulders ached from tension. The cabin remained undisturbed, but Frank went through the same security check as the night before windows door workshop perimeter. Everything was clear. Everything was normal. Yet the sense of being watched persisted, that combat instinct, whispering that danger was close, even when evidence said otherwise. He spent Thursday afternoon organizing the guest room for David's family, changing sheets that hadn't been changed in months, dusting surfaces that had accumulated layers of neglect. The work was practical, but also symbolic. Preparing space for family meant believing he'd still be around to welcome them. Meant choosing hope over resignation. By evening, exhaustion finally caught up. Frank heated a can of soup, ate it, standing at the counter, then collapsed into the recliner with the shotgun prop beside him. The television played news. He didn't process background noise, while his mind churned through scenarios and contingencies. The phone call came at 9:30, jolting him awake from a doze he hadn't realized he'd fallen into. Ray's voice came urgent and low. Frank, we've got a problem. Harris just called. They found Wade's truck abandoned on a logging road about 5 miles from your place. Engine was still warm. Frank was already moving, reaching for the shotgun. You think he's coming? Here, I think you need to get out of that cabin. Now, go to the church. The sound of breaking glass cut through the night, sharp and immediate. Frank spun toward the kitchen window, where a rock the size of a fist lay among scattered shards. And outside, barely visible in the darkness, a figure moved between the trees. He's here! Frank kept his voice steady, shotgun already raised. I'll call you back. Frank, don't! He hung up, dialed 911, gave his address in clipped military precision. Active threat, armed homeowner, send units immediately. Then he moved away from the windows, positioning himself where he could see both the front door and the kitchen entry, shotgun trained on the darkness beyond the broken glass. Wade's voice drifted through the shattered window, slurred with alcohol, but steady with purpose. I know you're in there, old man, hiding behind your gun like the coward you are. Frank didn't respond. Giving away his position would be tactical stupidity. He waited, breathing steady, finger resting along the trigger guard, remembering training from a war 50 years past that apparently never left you. You think you're some kind of hero, saving the poor waitress from the bad boss? Wade's laugh came harsh and bitter. Claire was nothing before me. Trash running from her junkie ex-husband. I gave her a job when nobody else would. And this is how she thanks me. The figure moved closer, resolving into Wade's shape, stockier than Frank remembered moving, with the careful deliberation of someone drunk enough to be dangerous, but not so drunk they couldn't function. He carried something in his right hand. In the darkness, Frank couldn't tell if it was a gun or a bottle. "Come out here and face me like a man." Frank stayed silent, shotgun steady. In the distance, sirens began their approach, faint but growing louder. Maybe 5 minutes away, maybe less. Long enough for things to go catastrophically wrong. Wade picked up another rock, hurled it through a different window. The crash echoed through the cabin glass, raining onto the floor. "Fine, you want to hide. I'll come in there and drag you out." He moved toward the front door. Frank shifted position, keeping the shotgun trained center mass 30 feet of distance between them. If Wade came through that door, if he was armed, Frank would have maybe 2 seconds to decide whether to fire. The sirens grew louder. Wade heard them too, his head jerking toward the sound. For a moment he froze, caught between rage and self-preservation. Then he made his choice. "This isn't over. You hear me? You and that bitch. This isn't over." He ran crashing through the underbrush toward wherever he'd left transportation. Frank stayed in position, didn't lower the shotgun, didn't move from cover until red and blue lights swept across the cabin walls and Sheriff Harris burst through the front door with 2 deputies behind him, weapons drawn. "Clear," Frank called out, finally lowering the shotgun. "He's gone. Headed north into the woods." Harris radioed for backup, sent deputies in pursuit, then turned to Frank with an expression caught between relief and frustration. "You okay? Couple broken windows. Pride a little damaged. Otherwise fine. This is exactly what I warned you about." Frank set the shotgun on the table, suddenly aware of how badly his hands were shaking. Not fear, adrenaline dumped, the aftershock of combat readiness with nowhere to discharge. "You were right. I was stubborn. Old habits." "Can you come to the station? Give a formal statement. Can I board up my windows first?" Harris helped pulling plywood from Frank's workshop and nailing it over the broken glass while deputies combed the woods with flashlights and K9 units. The dogs picked up Wade's trail, tracked it to a dirt road where tire marks suggested he'd had a second vehicle waiting. Smart enough to know his truck would be spotted. Smart enough to plan an escape route. At the sheriff's station, Frank gave a statement while drinking coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. Ray showed up halfway through, out of breath from running. "Are you trying to give me a heart attack?" "Wasn't intentional." Frank managed a weak smile. "Though I understand if you want to reconsider our friendship." Ray pulled up a chair, sat down heavily. "David called me. Wanted to know if you were okay. Apparently the 911 call got logged and somehow made its way to news outlets. Local reporter called him asking for comment about Frank Donovan, 67-year-old standoff with dangerous criminal." Frank closed his eyes. "That's just perfect. He's driving down tomorrow instead of next weekend. Said he's not waiting when his father's being threatened. Sarah's coming too. They're leaving the kids with her parents, didn't want to bring them into potential danger." The guilt hit like physical force. "Great. So my stubbornness isn't just risking my life, it's disrupting my son's. Or it's bringing your family together." Ray's tone softened. David didn't sound angry, Frank. He sounded worried. Sounded like a son who cares about his father and wants to make sure he's okay. "That's not a burden, that's a gift." Sheriff Harris returned with updated information. "Wade ditched the second vehicle 3 miles east. We found it abandoned with the engine still running. K9 units tracked his scent to Highway 22 where it goes cold. He either got picked up by someone or flagged down a ride, so he's in the wind again. For now. But we've got him on video from a gas station security camera filling up the second vehicle yesterday afternoon. His face is clear, identifiable. I've sent it to every law enforcement agency in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Someone will spot him, unless he leaves the region entirely." Harris didn't disagree. It was after midnight when Frank finally made it back to his cabin, the plywood over his windows making it look like a house under siege, which he supposed it was. He collapsed into bed, fully clothed, shotgun within arm's reach, and managed 3 hours of sleep before dawn dragged him back to consciousness. Friday morning, he drove to the church to check on Claire and Tommy. Deputy Martinez had been replaced by Deputy Chen, a stocky man in his 50s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd worked overnight shifts for decades. Claire met Frank at the door, Tommy hiding behind her legs. "We heard what happened. Are you okay?" Frank nodded, not trusting his voice immediately. The reality of last night was starting to sink in, how close it had come to violence, how easily it could have ended with him shooting Wade or Wade shooting him. The weight of it pressed down on his shoulders. Tommy peeked out from behind his mother. "You're really brave, Mr. Frank." "Not brave, just old and stubborn." Isn't that the same thing? The kid's logic made Frank smile despite everything. "Maybe, but next time I'll try being smart instead." Claire stepped onto the landing, closing the door behind her so Tommy wouldn't hear. "This is my fault. If I hadn't asked for help, if I just kept quiet." Frank held up a hand, stopping her. "We've had this conversation. Wade's actions are Wade's choices. You asking for help isn't what made him violent. Being violent is what made him violent. All you did was stop accepting it. But now you're in danger. Your family is... My family is fine. Better than fine. My son is driving down today specifically because he cares what happens to me. 8 years we didn't speak, and now he's dropping everything to make sure I'm okay. That's not danger, Claire. That's healing." She wiped her eyes, nodded slowly. "I just feel like everyone's sacrificing so much for me. People sacrifice for things that matter. You and Tommy matter. Don't ever think otherwise." Ray emerged from the church below, waving to get Frank's attention. Frank descended the stairs, leaving Claire to gather herself in private. Harris called. "They've got a development. Wade tried to use his credit card at a motel in Klamath Falls last night. Card was declined, but the desk clerk recognized him from the bolo photos. Called it in. By the time police arrived, he was gone, but they've got surveillance footage showing him getting into a white sedan with Idaho plates. Idaho Ryan. That's the working theory. Either Wade contacted Ryan or Ryan's been in touch with Wade all along. Either way, they're together now, and that makes them significantly more dangerous." The implications settled like lead in Frank's stomach. Two violent men with nothing to lose and a shared target. Claire wasn't just dealing with an angry ex-boss anymore. She was dealing with a coalition of threats. "We need to tell Claire." Ray shook his head. "Harris wants to wait, doesn't want to panic her until they have confirmation. The surveillance footage is being analyzed to see if they can ID the driver. She has a right to know. She has a right to feel safe long enough to sleep through the night. We tell her when we know for certain, not before." Frank wanted to argue but couldn't find the logic to support it. Sometimes not knowing was mercy. Sometimes information was just another burden. David arrived at 4 in the afternoon driving a silver Subaru that looked out of place against the cabin's rural backdrop. He emerged from the driver's seat, taller than Frank remembered, broader, through the shoulders with gray threading through his dark hair that made him look like a younger version of Frank himself. Sarah followed, a petite woman with kind eyes and an expression that suggested she'd prepared herself for something difficult. The hug was awkward at first, 8 years of distance making physical affection feel foreign. But then David's arms tightened and Frank felt his son's shoulders shake with emotion, and all the practiced words disappeared into something more fundamental. This was his boy, his son, the person he'd failed and lost and somehow been given a chance to know again. "I'm sorry." Frank didn't know if he was apologizing for last night or the last 8 years or all of it combined. "I'm so sorry." David pulled back, wiped his eyes. "Me too, Dad. I should have called. Should have tried harder to fix things." Sarah hugged Frank next, surprising him with her warmth. "Thank you for calling, David. He's been carrying that silence around for so long. Finally being able to let it go. It's changed him." They spent the evening at the cabin, talking through the events of recent weeks, David listening with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a father he thought he knew, but clearly didn't. When Frank explained about Claire and Tommy, about Wade and the restraining order, and last night's attack, David's expression shifted through concern to something that looked like pride. "You're helping people. Actually helping. Not just talking about honor and duty, but living it." "Trying to? Not sure I'm doing it right." Sarah leaned forward. "Can we meet them, Claire and Tommy? I don't want to overwhelm them. They've been through enough." David shook his head. "We want to help Dad. However we can, even if it's just being there, adding to the community you've built around them." Saturday morning they drove to the church together, David behind the wheel of his Subaru while Frank rode passenger. The role reversal felt significant somehow. Frank letting his son drive literally and metaphorically, taking the passenger seat, trusting someone else to navigate. Claire answered the apartment door with Tommy beside her, both of them surprised by the additional visitors. Frank made introductions, watched David crouch down to Tommy's level, to admire the latest drawings. Watched Sarah sit with Claire in the kitchen, sharing coffee and conversation that quickly moved past surface pleasantries into something deeper. By afternoon, Tommy was showing David his favorite spot in the church library, while Sarah and Claire talked about resources for women's shelters and legal aid organizations Sarah knew through her work as a social worker in Seattle. Frank stood with Ray, watching the pieces come together. You've built something here. Something good. Not me. Community did this. You started it. Ray's tone carried weight. You saw someone in need and you didn't look away. Everything else grew from that single decision. Don't minimize what you've done, Frank. The peaceful moment shattered when Sheriff Harris arrived, expression grim. He asked to speak with Frank and Ray privately away from Claire. They stepped into Ray's office. We've confirmed the white sedan from Klamath Falls, registered to Ryan Montgomery. We've also got facial recognition match on the driver. It's definitely Ryan, which means Wade and Ryan are together, and based on cell tower pings, they're heading back this direction. When best estimate, they'll be in the Oak Ridge area by tonight. Frank's blood ran cold. What's the plan? Harris pulled out a map, marked several locations. We've got units stationed at the church, at your cabin, at the library, anywhere we think they might target. We've also contacted the FBI. Ryan crossed state lines with active warrants that makes it federal. They're sending agents from the Eugene office. And until they arrive, we wait, we watch, and we pray these two idiots are smart enough to realize they're surrounded and give up peacefully. But the tension in Harris's voice suggested he didn't believe that would happen. Neither did Frank. David insisted on staying at the church with Claire, and Tommy said he'd spent too many years being absent and wasn't about to start again now. Sarah agreed, her professional experience with trauma survivors making her valuable support. Frank wanted to argue, wanted to protect his son from potential danger, but the look David gave him said clearly, I'm not a child anymore. Let me help. So Frank found himself back at his cabin with Ray. As the sun set, both of them armed. Frank with his shotgun, Ray with a pistol he'd admitted to owning, but rarely touched. They sat in darkness with the lights off, watching the driveway, watching the woods, waiting for violence that felt inevitable. The attack came at 9 o'clock, but not where anyone expected. Frank's phone rang, Harris' voice tight with controlled urgency. They hit the library, Molotov cocktail through the front window. Building's on fire. Fire department is en route, but Wade knows we're watching the church and your place, so he's hitting secondary targets to draw resources away. Exactly. I'm pulling 2 units from the church to help with fire response. You and Ray need to get to Claire now. This was a distraction. Frank and Ray were moving before the call ended, piling into Frank's truck and racing toward town. The fire was visible from 2 miles away, orange flames licking up through the library, roof smoke billowing black against the night sky. But they didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The library was already lost. Claire and Tommy were still savable. They screeched into the church parking lot to find Deputy Chen standing outside his patrol car, hand on his weapon, scanning the darkness. He turned as Frank's headlights swept across him. Everything secure. No movement. Frank didn't feel relieved. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck were standing up, that old combat instinct screaming warning. Where's David and Sarah? They're inside with Claire and Tommy. Haven't seen anyone approach the building. Ray pulled out his phone, dialed David. It rang 6 times, went to voicemail. Tried Sarah. Same result. That's when they heard it, a child's scream cut short, coming from inside the church. Frank was running before thought caught up, shotgun raised, Chen and Ray right behind him. The front door was unlocked. Wrong, it should have been locked. They burst into the sanctuary lights, blazing, and found it empty. The scream had come from upstairs, the apartment. They took the stairs 3 at a time. The apartment door stood ajar, swinging gently in a breeze that shouldn't exist. Frank pushed through, clearing the main room empty. Kitchen empty. First bedroom empty. The second bedroom door was closed. Frank approached every sense, screaming danger. He tested the handle, locked from inside. Claire, Tommy, David. A voice answered, but it wasn't any of theirs. Wade's voice, thick with chemical courage and rage. Come in here and I'll kill them all. Every single one. Frank's blood turned to ice. Ray was already on the phone with Harris, whispering urgently. Chen had his weapon drawn, positioned at a tactical angle. Wade, this is Sheriff Harris. I'm on my way. Whatever's happening, we can talk about it. Frank heard the phone inside. Wade must have Claire's cell on speaker. Too late for talking, Sheriff. These people destroyed my life. Time for them to pay. You hurt anyone in there, you'll never walk free again. But if you let them go now, we can work something out. Work something out. Wade's laugh came unhinged. I've got nothing left. No business, no reputation, no future. You already took everything. What more can you threaten me with? Ryan's voice joined Wade's, younger and more volatile. We want $40,000. Cash. Delivered within the hour or we start hurting people. So that was the play. Ryan's debt, Wade's rage combined into a ransom scheme that had no good outcome even if the money was paid. We can get you money. Frank kept his voice steady, military calm. Just let everyone go. Keep me. I'm the one who started this. I'll trade myself for them. Silence from inside. Then wait again. You think I'm stupid? The second I open this door, your sheriff friend plugs me full of holes. No one's shooting anyone. Harris's voice carried authority. Frank, stand down. Let me handle this. But Frank was already moving, making a decision that violated every tactical principle he'd ever learned. He set down the shotgun, raised his hands, and knocked on the door. Wade, I'm unarmed. I'm opening the door and coming in. Alone. You can take me hostage and let everyone else go. Dad, no. David's voice muffled but clear. Frank tried the handle. Still locked. Wade. The door cracked open. Through the gap, Frank saw Wade, face flushed and sweating, holding a knife to Sarah's throat. Behind him, Ryan gripped Tommy, one arm around the boy's chest. Claire and David sat on the floor, David bleeding from a cut above his eye, Claire's wrists bound with electrical tape. You come in, old man, and I'll kill her anyway. Just for fun. Then what's your play? You can't leave. You can't stay. You wanted money, but money doesn't fix this. Wade's eyes darted, trapped animal, looking for escape that didn't exist. Ryan looked worse, twitching pupils blown clearly high on something that made him unpredictable. We want a car. And the money. And no cops following us. Harris's voice came from the hallway. Not happening, but I'll give you a phone. Direct line to the FBI negotiator. Let them talk you through how this ends without anyone dying. Suddenly, Ryan moved, shoving Tommy toward the door. The boy stumbled, fell through the gap into Frank's arms. Frank caught him, pulled him close, felt the kid's heart hammering against his chest. Go. Ryan's voice cracked with desperation. Before I changed my mind, Frank didn't question it. Backed away from the door with Tommy, handed him to Ray, who was already reaching. The door slammed shut again, locked from inside. Tommy was sobbing, clinging to Ray. Frank returned to the door. You let Tommy go. That's good. That's the right move. Let the others go too. You can keep me. I'm the one Wade wants. Inside voices argued, Wade and Ryan fighting over strategy, their coalition fracturing under pressure. Frank heard Sarah whimpering, heard David trying to talk them down with the calm rationality of someone trained in crisis management. Then a crash, glass breaking, screams. Frank didn't think. Kicked the door with everything he had. Old wood, old locket splintered on the second kick. He crashed through to find chaos. Ryan had smashed the window trying to escape. Wade still held the knife, but Sarah had broken free, was scrambling toward Claire. David was on his feet, putting himself between the women and Wade. Ryan was halfway out the window, one leg over the sill. Frank grabbed for Ryan's collar, yanked him back. They fell together, tumbling across the floor. The younger man fought with desperate strength, all elbows and knees and wild punches. One caught Frank in the ribs, driving air from his lungs. Then Chen was there, pulling Ryan off, wrestling him into submission. Harris burst through with two more deputies' weapons drawn. Wade looked at the tactical situation, three armed deputies, nowhere to run, and dropped the knife. Raised his hands in surrender. The aftermath moved in fragments Frank couldn't quite piece together into coherent narrative. Paramedics arriving, checking Sarah for injuries, bandaging David's head, examining Claire's wrists where the tape had cut circulation. Wade and Ryan being cuffed, rights, being read, both of them shouting accusations and threats that no longer carried weight. Frank sat on the floor where he'd ended up, ribs screaming, breathing painful. David appeared beside him, helped him up. You're hurt. I'm old. Everything hurts. Are you okay? David touched the bandage over his eye. This nothing. Dad, you could have been killed. Yeah, but I wasn't, and neither were you. That's all that matters. Sarah approached, wrapped Frank in a hug that made his ribs protest, but he didn't care. Thank you. You saved us. Community saved you. I just showed up. She laughed slightly, hysterical. That's what heroes do. They show up. 4 weeks later, Frank stood in his cabin living room, surrounded by more people than the space was designed to hold. David and Sarah had stayed taking over the guest room, helping repair the broken windows and the fractured pieces of Frank's isolated life. Emma and Liam had arrived 3 days ago, and the cabin that had felt like a tomb for 5 years now rang with children's laughter. Tommy sat with Emma on the floor, both of them drawing, while Liam narrated an elaborate story involving dinosaurs and space aliens. Claire helped in the kitchen, preparing enough food for the gathering. Ray had organized a community dinner, celebrating not just survival, but the connections forged through crisis. Ray arrived with Linda Oakes and Dr. Martinez and Sheriff Harris, and a dozen others who'd played roles in helping Claire escape her cage. They crowded into the small space, overflowing onto the porch, sharing food and stories, and the kind of fellowship that felt earned rather than obligatory. Wade was serving 18 months for assault in violation of restraining order, with additional charges pending from the library arson. Ryan was being extradited to Idaho to face his original warrants, plus kidnapping charges from the hostage situation. Both men would be gone for years, long enough for Claire and Tommy to build new lives without looking over their shoulders. Claire had taken the church's offer of employment, was working with the Sunday school program, and discovering she had a gift for teaching children. Tommy thrived his drawings, covering half the walls in their apartment, each one showing increasing skill and confidence. Some showed heroes fighting villains. Others just showed families simple, happy together. Frank stood on the porch with David, watching the sunset over mountains that had witnessed all of it. His son put an arm around his shoulders. Mom would be proud of you. I should have done this years ago. Help people. Been part of a community. Instead, I sat here feeling sorry for myself. You did it when it mattered. That's what counts. Through the window, they could see Emma showing Tommy how to shade three-dimensional shapes, her older sister patience evident in every gesture. Liam had climbed into Claire's lap, demanding a story that she was reading with theatrical flair. Sarah and Ray were deep in conversation about expanding the church's social services program. This is good, Dad, what you've built here. Not just helping Claire, but reconnecting with community, with me, with yourself. Frank nodded, throat too tight for words. 67 years it had taken him to learn that strength wasn't isolation. That honor wasn't just a word you said, but something you did when the world wasn't watching. That the hardest kind of courage was asking for help and accepting it when it came. The story spread beyond. Oak Ridge local news picked it up, then regional outlets, then someone wrote an article for a national magazine about the retired carpenter who'd stood between danger and the vulnerable, about the community that had rallied about the proof that goodness could come from the most unexpected places. Frank didn't read the articles, didn't need the validation or attention. He had everything that mattered right here: family that had returned, friends who'd never really left, and the knowledge that when life had asked him to be the kind of man Mary believed he could be, he hadn't turned away. The last light faded behind the mountains, turning the sky purple and gold. Inside, someone started singing off-key but enthusiastic. Others joined, creating harmony from disparate voices. Frank stood with his son on the porch of a cabin that no longer felt like a tomb, and for the first time since Mary died, he felt something other than regret when thinking about the future. There would be more meals like this, more gatherings. Emma and Liam would visit regularly. David had already talked about moving closer, maybe finding work in Eugene so the distance wasn't so great. Claire had dreams of finishing her teaching degree. Tommy wanted to attend art school someday. The future held promise instead of just endings. And Frank Donovan, 67 years old with bad knees and worse history, had somehow become part of something larger than his own pain. Had learned that it's never too late to matter, never too late to help, never too late to be the person you should have been all along. Behind him, Ray appeared with 2 beers. Handed one to Frank, one to David, raised his own in toast. To second chances. They drank to that, to second chances, and found family and communities built from people who chose to see each other's struggles instead of looking away. To honor that wasn't just about being right, but about being present. To courage that looked like an old man standing in a doorway offering himself instead of others. To the last good man becoming the first of many.